Kal Kadosh, Boker Or, Bekiim Bahalacha 2, day 55, page 181, Halacha Lamed Aleph, 31. We're now talking about like this. If someone performed Netilat Yadayim onto the ground, care should be taken not to tread on the place where it was spilled. We kept on mentioning this again on the day of yesterday. Don't step upon it because the harmful forces might damage you. So he says once the ground is dried, so then there's no problem. Okay, there's no problem of walking on it. Says the 180, the footnote, this is the ruling of the Eshel Avram Bochach. He explained that as long as the ground is moist, the harmful forces still lurk there, and they might harm someone. But once it becomes dry, there's no problem anymore. But there's no harmful spirits or whatever. They're not there anymore. Okay, fine. 32. It is permissible, right? He comes here like this. He says it is permissible to recite blessings or to study Torah, this 32, right, while standing or sitting directly in front of the water that was used for the morning Netilat Yadayim. It's not necessary to cover the water, meaning even though the water could become tameh, but it's not that you can't do it, you can't make a bracha or you can't learn. It could be right in front of you, but there's no problem. There's no problem of doing that. Nevertheless, it's considered an act of piety to keep the water covered or to turn away from it when saying berachot or birkat Torah or all these things. Act of piety. If a revit of fresh water, right, page 182, if a revit of fresh water is poured onto the water used for Netilat Yadayim, it is permissible, even according to the strictest opinions, right, to recite the berachot or study Torah in its presence. This obviously since the Gemara forbids one to say berachot in front of urine. But if the revit of water is poured onto urine, so then you're allowed to. Since there's no source in the Talmud to do with the concept of Netilat Yadayim, so therefore there's no question that for sure if you poured a revit of water, there's no problem. Yeah, that for sure you could do. Fine. Next, this is 181 in the footnote. So the footnote says that Rav Chida testified that the practice of the pious is to avoid learning Torah or saying berachot in the presence of the water in Netilat Yadayim, and this was also the Rav Chaim Abulafia. The response to Chelek Halevi challenged the wisdom of this stringency, since it's clear from the Shulchan Aruch that it's permissible to say berachot and learning Torah in front of the Maimon Netilat Yadayim. If it is permitted while the harmful forces are on the hands, right? So he says it certainly must be permitted while the presence of the water contaminated by those harmful forces, meaning you could make berachot, because remember in the olden days they used to do birkot shachar even before Netilat Yadayim. Right? Even before Netilat Yadayim, they used to do birkot shachar, because when they used to wake up in the morning, immediately, then pokeach ivrim, then and by the time he did Netilat Yadayim, it was only after a few berachot. So he's saying, if you're allowed to come and do berachot when you have the tumah on your hands, kal v'chomer if the tumah is on water, which is in a receptacle beside you in a kli, for sure you could do that. So he says that Rishon LeZion, who responded that Rav Chida followed the opinion of the Holy Zohar that it is forbidden. Right? He said, right, to recite a blessing before performing the morning Netilat Yadayim. The Rishon LeZion then cited the Magen Avraham, Siyal Kut Yosef, Berachot, ruling that it is permissible to perform the mitzvah Mayim Achronim under a table, since people do not walk there, and there is no fear that people will then tread on the wet ground. According to this, it is permissible to recite Birkat Hamazon in the immediate vicinity of the water contaminated. So you could say Birkat Hamazon then. You could say Birkat Hamazon on the water, beside the water. However, the Rishon LeZion concluded we cannot equate the harmful forces Mayim Achronim to Netilat Yadayim. Right? It's not the same thing. So he says, likewise also says the same thing between the water used for Mayim Achronim and the water of Netilat Yadayim. The Kav HaChaim ruled that it is permissible technically to say Birkat Hamazon while the Mayim Achronim is in a bowl on the table. In that case, of course, the water is not contaminated by harmful forces, whereas the water of Netilat Yadayim is contaminated, even when it's spilled into a container and not on the ground. In conclusion, there's no basis to say that it's forbidden according to the halacha, but there's basis for a pious to be stringent. Indeed, this is what the Rav Chida made clear. Although he said in Keshet Gudal, right, Keshet Godel, he says that it is forbidden to recite blessings or Torah study in presence of the water, and this is repeated in the Kaf HaChaim Falache. These poskim, they made it as a chumrah. It wasn't like a zalacha. And the truth is, right, that the Rav Chida, he comes and he says this, is the Rav Chida and the Ben Ish Chai stated that the water used for morning Netilat Yadayim are more strongly contaminated than urine, and that is why it must be covered, and nevertheless is only a stringency for the pious. Harav Labaton ruled, he comes and he ruled, right, that if the revi'it of clean water is poured onto water used for Netilat Yadayim, there is no basis for any stringency at all. Meaning just pour a revi'it and then that's it. And this is clear since it's permitted to say even Birkat Shachar and all these berachot in front of a revi'it of water that was poured on top of the urine. So for sure, there's no problem with this as well. What about now covering the water? Okay, so I'm in the footnote of 183. Covering the water. I just cover it and that's it. So Yekut Yosef ruled that if someone covers the water after it was used in Netilat Yadayim, it is then perfectly permissible to save brachot and everything without any problem. And that's also the Siman of Mayim Achronim. By the way, that's why the Mayim Achronim is covered. And you come and you just pour it and it goes through the holes because it's covered. Why is it covered? So you could say Birkat Hamazon and then you put it on top again and it's 100% covered. The Lachabra, however, permitted this only if it would be difficult to remove the water, right, from one's presence. This seems to be clearly the position of the Rav Chida, right, who wrote, when someone rises in the morning and is not able to spill out to use water, cover it. Then he may say the brachot. So it's mashma that keilu, that only if you can't spill it out, then you cover. Apparently, the author of Yalkut Yosef was unaware of this citation. Indeed, the original edition of the Yalkut Yosef, which was authored by the Ren Shalom Tzion himself, there's no mention that one may simply cover the water instead of disposing of it. Meaning, the original Yalkut Yosef, which was of Rav Ovadia, there it's not brought down, right? That covering it. It was only later on that they added in, no, just cover it. So fine. What about if someone used the revi'it of water for Netilat Yadayim? The Or Letzion suggested that the stringency of avoiding reciting blessings in the presence of water used for the morning Netilat Yadayim applies only if the person poured less than a revi'it on each, right, on each hand each time. If he poured a revi'it or more of water each time, the harmful forces do not contaminate the water, and there's no basis for any stringency. He compared this to halacha regarding the water used for Netilat Yadayim for a meal. When someone pours a revi'it of water, right, at once, the water does not become tmeim. In the same way, it will not become infected with any harmful forces. It is unclear, however, whether this comparison is valid. Although a revi'it of water is not susceptible for tumah, right, it very well may be susceptible to harmful forces, right? No other poskim suggested this leniency, therefore it's recommended not to follow it. Meaning that try not to just cover, right? He says, if someone used the revi'it of water for Netilat Yadayim, they don't like this leniency, okay? Fine. Next. 33. Touching hands that have not yet been purified. Can you touch somebody else's hands if he didn't do Netilat Yadayim yet? So it says if someone performed the mitzvah of Netilat Yadayim and then touched the hands of another person who did not do Netilat Yadayim, he has to do Netilat Yadayim again. Pouring water on the hands 3 times alternately. He says this is halacha even if both persons' hands were completely dry when they touched each other. Right? This halacha applies only if someone touched the fingers of the person who had not performed Netilat Yadayim. If he touched the person's palms, right, but not the fingers, it's not necessary to do Netilat Yadayim. Meaning if you only touch here, no. If you touch any of the fingers, yes. Let's see, 182. He says the Or Letzion ruled that this halacha applies only if the person's hands were wet with the water used for Netilat Yadayim. But if the hands were already dried, he does not have to repeat Netilat Yadayim. The Rishon Letzion counted that according to Rav Chaim Falache, he must repeat Netilat Yadayim in either case. And it appears that the Ben Ish Chai agreed that the halacha is the same whether the person's hands are wet or dry. The harmful forces can infect other people, even if their hands are dry. The halacha differentiates between wet hands and dry hands regarding the mitzvah of Netilat Yadayim for eating bread. That is, if someone performed Netilat Yadayim for eating bread, and before he dried his hands, he touched someone else's hands, right? Before the second person performed Netilat Yadayim, the first person must dry his hands and repeat the act of Netilat Yadayim. If he dried his hands before touching those of the second person, however, his hands are not defiled, and he does not need to repeat the mitzvah. This differentiation does not apply to the mitzvah of the morning Netilat Yadayim, when the issue is not impurity, but the harmful forces. In this case, the harmful forces can contaminate his hands even after they have been dried. Okay, the response to Kapei Aaron is real, right? Ruled leniently, concurring with the Or Letzion. But Maran and the Rishon Letzion concluded the discussion with a stringent decision. Meaning that's why he just said, no, this is what you have to do. He was actually stringent and not lenient. Okay.